Hey everyone, I noticed a lot of you who are watching and enjoying the content aren't subscribed yet. If you love spine-chilling stories, creepy encounters, and unexplained mysteries, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on the next terrifying upload. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you more of the content you love. I used to think those creepy dating stories were made up for attention until I became one. It started last month when my friend Mark wouldn't stop bugging me about being single. He kept going on about his wife's friend who was just my type. After 3 weeks of constant nagging, I caved in. The restaurant was this mid-range Italian place downtown. Nothing fancy but nice enough for a first date. I got there early, fidgeting with my napkin and checking my watch every few minutes. When Sarah walked in, she looked exactly like the photo Mark had shown me. Long dark hair, well-dressed, attractive. But something about her eyes made me uncomfortable. They were too intense, like she was scanning me, processing every detail. During dinner, I noticed weird things. She'd mentioned specific details about my life that I hadn't shared. She knew I'd switched from LA Fitness to Planet Fitness last month. She brought up my recent promotion at work. She even knew about my sister's new baby in Colorado. I tried to brush it off, thinking Mark and his wife must have told her, but the knot in my stomach kept growing. The real red flag came when she casually mentioned Max, my childhood golden retriever. I'd never posted about him online, and even Mark didn't know about Max. He was from before we met. When I asked how she knew, she just smiled and changed the subject. I made up an excuse about an early meeting and practically ran to my car. That night, my phone started blowing up. Messages from different numbers, all saying similar things. Had such a great time. Can't wait to see you again. You look cute when you're nervous. I blocked each number, but new ones kept coming. Then they got darker. You can't hide from me. We belong together. I'm always watching. By morning, my social media was flooded with follow requests from accounts I didn't recognize. Each profile picture was just slightly out of focus, but I could tell they were all her. I set everything to private and deleted my dating profiles. 3 days after the date, I was at work when my coworker asked who my girlfriend was. Apparently, she'd been standing outside her building for hours, just staring up at my window. I'm on the 12th floor, but somehow she knew exactly where my desk was. Security went to check, but she vanished before they got there. The gym incident really shook me. I was on the treadmill when she appeared out of nowhere, taking the machine right next to me. She acted like it was completely normal, like we'd planned a meet there. I never told her which gym I went to. I left my workout mid-session, but when I got to my car, she was already in the parking lot, waving at me from her car. Things escalated when she showed up at my parents' house. They lived 2 hours away in a small town, and I'd never mentioned them during our date. She told my mom we were engaged and started sharing detailed stories about our relationship. She knew about my dad's heart surgery last year and my mom's garden club meetings. When my mom called me, confused and concerned, I felt my blood run cold. I started staying at different friends' houses, never telling anyone where I'd be. But somehow, she always found me. Every morning I'd wake up to messages describing what I'd done the day before, what I was wearing, who I talked to. She knew when I skipped lunch, when I took different routes to work, even when I bought new clothes. The photos started arriving next, me getting coffee, me at my desk, me asleep in my bed, all taken without my knowledge. Some were clearly shot through my windows, others seemed taken inside my apartment. I changed my locks 3 times, installed security cameras, but nothing helped. She was always one step ahead. When I went to the police, they said they needed more evidence. Then I found a USB drive on my kitchen counter in my locked apartment. It contained hundreds of photos of me going back months before our date. There were videos too, recorded conversations I'd had in my own home. The police finally took it seriously. I did some research and discovered her real identity. Her name wasn't Sarah, it was Rebecca Thorne. She'd done this before to other men in nearby cities. Same pattern, one date, then months of stalking. Some had to move across the country to escape her. Last week I finally got a restraining order, but it made no difference. Notes kept appearing in my apartment. Distance makes the heart grow fonder. You can't hide forever. We're meant to be together. The worst revelation came yesterday. I was talking to Mark about the whole situation and he looked confused. He said he'd never set me up on a date. His wife didn't know any Sarah or Rebecca. The number that had texted me pretending to be Mark's wife was fake. The entire setup had been orchestrated by her. I'm in a hotel room now, throwing everything I own into suitcases. My phone hasn't stopped buzzing with messages from new numbers. The last one just came through. Your room has a nice view of the parking lot. Blue looks good on you. I ran out and got as far away as possible. Police found my hotel room empty that night. My suitcases were still there, half packed, but I was gone. What they didn't find was any sign of struggle or forced entry. The security cameras in the hallway mysteriously stopped working for exactly 7 minutes. 3 days later, my car was discovered in a shopping center parking lot 2 states away. The only thing inside was a Polaroid photo of me and Sarah, no, Rebecca, smiling together at what looked like a cabin. On the back, in neat handwriting, "Finally together." I'm writing this now from somewhere I can't disclose. I managed to escape that night at the hotel, but barely. I saw her coming down the hallway as I was taking out the trash. Pure luck. I ran down the emergency stairs and didn't stop running until I was far away. The police are still looking for Rebecca Thorne, but she's good at disappearing. They found evidence linking her to 5 other missing men across 3 states. All of them started with a blind date. I'm safer now, but I still check over my shoulder everywhere I go. Because the truth is, I don't think she's given up. Sometimes when my phone buzzes with an unknown number, I wonder if she's still watching. I need to write this down while it's still fresh in my memory. Last night was supposed to be just another blind date, but nothing about what happened makes sense, and I'm starting to question everything. It started 3 weeks ago when my coworker Sarah wouldn't stop talking about her husband's friend, who she thought would be perfect for me. I'd been single for a while, and honestly, her constant matchmaking was getting annoying. But after she showed me his picture, this tall guy with dark hair and kind eyes, I figured one dinner wouldn't kill me. We arranged to meet at Salvatore's, this Italian place downtown that's been around forever. I remember checking my makeup one last time in my car mirror before heading in. It was a Wednesday night, and the restaurant wasn't too busy. I spotted him right away, standing by the entrance in a blue button-down shirt that made him look like he'd just walked out of a magazine. His name was Michael, and from the moment we started talking, everything felt weirdly perfect. You know how first dates usually have those awkward silences and forced conversations? This wasn't like that at all. He told me about growing up in Colorado, his job in software development, and his golden retriever named Max. I found myself telling him things I usually keep to myself, like my weird theory about parallel universes and my secret dream of opening a bookstore. The food was amazing. I got the chicken parmesan while he had the seafood linguine. He knew all about wines and suggested this incredible Chianti that paired perfectly with our meals. We shared a tiramisu for dessert, and he had this cute way of carefully scraping off the cocoa powder before taking a bite. The restaurant was closing by the time we finished. I remember checking my phone and being shocked that it was already 10:30. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the wind had picked up. Michael offered to walk me to my car, which was parked in the lot behind the restaurant. The parking lot was mostly empty by then. There were maybe 5 or 6 cars scattered around, and the overhead lights were doing that annoying flickering thing that always makes parking lots feel creepy at night. We walked between the rows of cars, and I was digging through my purse for my keys while Michael talked about this hiking trail he discovered just outside the city. That's when everything went sideways. I hadn't found my keys yet when I noticed Michael had stopped talking mid-sentence. I turned around to ask him something, but he wasn't there. Just gone. The space where he had been walking was empty. I stood there for a moment, confused, thinking maybe he had stepped between some cars, but there was nowhere he could have gone. The lot was open, well lit despite the flickering, and completely exposed. No trees, no bushes, no barriers, nowhere to hide. I called out his name several times, my voice echoing off the surrounding buildings. Nothing. I even walked around the entire lot, checking between every car, behind the dumpsters, everywhere. He had completely vanished. My hands were shaking as I finally found my keys and practically ran to my car. When I got home, I immediately tried to find him online. No Michael Anderson on Facebook matching his description. No LinkedIn profile for a software developer with his name in our city. I even tried Instagram and Twitter. Nothing. The next morning at work, I marched straight to Sarah's desk to demand answers. But when I mentioned the date, she looked genuinely confused. She insisted she had never tried to set me up with anyone, and her husband didn't have any friends named Michael. I described him in detail, the blue shirt, his dog Max, everything. But she just kept shaking her head. I checked my phone for our text conversations about the date. All gone. I looked for the restaurant charge on my bank statement. Nothing. When I called Salvatore's to ask about our reservation, they had no record of it. But I know it happened. The leftover chicken parmesan was still in my fridge, wrapped in their distinctive takeout container. I had the receipt too, though the restaurant's name was now somehow smudged beyond recognition. A week later, I was reading through local news archives for a work project when I saw it. An article from 2018 about a missing person case. Michael Anderson, 34, software developer, disappeared from the parking lot behind Salvatore's restaurant on a Wednesday night in October. The photo showed him in a blue button-down shirt, smiling at the camera. It was him, my date, exactly as I remembered him, right down to the small scar above his eyebrow. I've gone back to the restaurant several times since then, always during daylight hours. Everything looks normal. The parking lot is just a parking lot. The hostess who seated us that night doesn't seem to remember us. The waiter who served our wine and joked about our shared dessert wasn't there anymore. I've tried to make sense of what happened. Maybe I imagined it all, but then how do I explain the leftovers? The receipt? The vivid memories of our conversations? I remember every detail of that night, the way he folded his napkin into triangles while we talked, how he mentioned his mother taught him to always pull out a chair for his date, the slight dimple in his left cheek when he smiled. Last night I drove past Salvatore's again. The parking lot was empty except for one car, a dark blue Honda Civic, exactly like the one described in Michael's missing person report. But when I circled back around for a second look, it was gone. I don't know what happened to Michael that night, either in 2018 or during our date. I don't know if I had dinner with a ghost, or if I somehow slipped into another timeline, or if there's some other explanation I haven't thought of yet. All I know is that someone who was there simply wasn't there anymore, and I'm left with nothing but questions and a smudged receipt. I never thought a Wednesday afternoon coffee date would end with police officers and handcuffs. It started as a typical blind date setup, you know, the kind where your friend won't stop insisting they've found your perfect match. Sarah had been pestering me for weeks about this amazing guy from her office, and I finally caved in, mostly to get her to stop bringing it up during our lunch breaks. We arranged to meet at the Bean House, this cozy cafe nestled between a bookstore and a vintage shop downtown. I remember fidgeting with my necklace as I waited, watching people hurry past the window. The cafe was busy but not crowded, with that perfect afternoon buzz of espresso machines and quiet conversations. When he walked in, I understood why Sarah had been so persistent. James was tall, with dark hair and warm brown eyes, wearing a perfectly fitted navy suit that suggested success without trying too hard. He spotted me immediately and walked over with this confident, easy smile that made my nervousness disappear. The first part of our date felt surprisingly natural. He had this way of making every question feel like the start of a fascinating conversation. We talked about his work in investment banking, and he told these engaging stories about his business trips to Tokyo and London. I found myself leaning in, completely absorbed in his descriptions of hidden restaurants in Shibuya and early morning walks along the Thames. He was in the middle of telling me about a sunset he'd watched from the Eiffel Tower when I noticed something odd. A group of people had entered the cafe, but they weren't heading to the counter. They were spreading out, moving with purpose. Before I could process what was happening, everything exploded into chaos. 4 police officers surrounded our table, while others blocked the exits. James's face changed so fast it was like watching a mask slip. The warm, charming expression vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. He didn't resist when they pulled him up from his chair and handcuffed him. I sat there, my hand still wrapped around my coffee cup, as they read him his rights. The next few hours were a blur of police stations and questions. A female detective named Martinez showed me a file that made my stomach turn. James wasn't James at all. His real name was Daniel Cooper, and he had warrants in 3 states. The photos showed him with different hair colors, different styles, different names, but always that same charming smile. The detective explained that he'd been running an elaborate scheme for years. He would integrate himself into different social circles, usually through work or mutual friends, then use these connections to meet women. Some relationships lasted weeks, others months. He collected personal information, opened credit cards, took out loans. One woman had lost her entire savings. Another had her identity stolen so completely she was still sorting out the mess 2 years later. I learned that at Sarah's office he'd gone by Michael Chen, working in their IT department. Before that, he was William Parker, a graphic designer in Seattle. Thomas Brooks, a real estate agent in Chicago. The list went on. Each identity was perfectly crafted, with fake references, social media profiles, even digital footprints going back years. The police had been tracking him for months, following a trail of stolen identities and broken trust across the country. They'd finally caught a break when someone recognized him from a police bulletin and reported seeing him at Sarah's company. While I sat in that interview room, more victims started arriving at the station. Women from all over the city, each with their own version of James. They all shared the same shocked expression I probably had. That horrible moment of realizing that someone you trusted was a complete fiction. The next few days felt surreal. Local news stations ran his story, showing mugshots next to screenshots from dating profiles. My phone kept buzzing with messages from Sarah, who was dealing with her own shock and guilt. Her company was in chaos, reviewing every system he'd had access to during his time there. I had to give 2 more statements over the next week. Each time the detectives found new details, new victims, new aliases. They discovered storage units filled with different wardrobes, documents, and electronics, everything he needed to become someone else at a moment's notice. 3 weeks after the arrest, I received a court summons. The prosecutor was building a case that spanned multiple jurisdictions, with charges ranging from identity theft to grand larceny. They had evidence of at least 20 different identities and more than 50 victims. Sitting in my apartment that night, I found myself staring at the single photo I had from that day, a quick snap Sarah had taken when I first arrived at the cafe, nervous but excited about meeting someone new. In the background, through the window, you can just make out a man in a navy suit walking toward the door. He looked so normal, so believable. I deleted the photo. The whole experience left me with more questions than answers. How many other lives had he lived? How many other women were out there, not yet knowing that their James or Michael or William was a carefully constructed lie? The detective told me they might never know the full extent of his deceptions. Last I heard, he was being held without bail, facing decades in prison if convicted. Sometimes I still catch myself thinking about those first 30 minutes of our date, before everything fell apart. I never believed in gut feelings until that day. You know that weird sensation when something feels off, but you can't explain why? I should have listened to mine when Sarah first mentioned setting me up on a blind date. But here I am, 3 months later, still looking over my shoulder everywhere I go. It started on a regular Tuesday in October. Sarah had been going on about this perfect guy she wanted me to meet. After weeks of her begging, I caved. She said he was successful, charming, and exactly my type. We arranged to meet at Cafe Luna, this quaint coffee shop downtown that I'd always loved for its warm lighting and corner booths. I remember every detail of that afternoon. The weather was unusually warm for October, and I'd chosen to wear my favorite navy blue dress. Walking into the cafe, I spotted him immediately. Tall, dark hair, wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit. He looked exactly like Sarah's description. Michael stood up when he saw me, and something in his eyes made me pause for a split second. They were intense, almost like he was memorizing every detail about me. The first 15 minutes seemed normal enough. We ordered coffee. He knew I preferred oat milk in mine without me mentioning it. I brushed it off, thinking Sarah must have told him. But then things started getting strange. He began mentioning things about my life. Casual references dropped into conversation that made my skin prickle. He talked about my previous job at Thompson & So, specifically mentioning the time I spilled coffee on my keyboard during my first week. That wasn't something I'd shared on social media or even with Sarah. Then he brought up my childhood dog Max, describing the exact spot on his ear where he had a white patch. I felt my hands getting clammy around my coffee cup. The details kept coming, each one more personal than the last. He knew about the treehouse in my grandmother's backyard, where I used to hide my diary. He mentioned the time I broke my arm falling from the apple tree when I was 9, even noting how I'd cried more about missing my ballet recital than about the actual injury. These weren't just lucky guesses. They were specific memories, private moments I'd never shared publicly. My coffee sat untouched as he continued, my stomach turning with each new revelation. When he started describing my recurring childhood nightmare about the man in the red coat who stood outside my window, I felt the room spin. That was something I'd never told anyone, not even my parents. I watched his face as he spoke, trying to place him, trying to understand how he could know these things. His expression was calm, almost amused, like he was enjoying my growing discomfort. When our eyes met, his held a knowing look that made me feel exposed, vulnerable. Making an excuse about suddenly feeling ill, I gathered my things quickly. He didn't seem surprised or disappointed. Instead, he smiled, this unsettling, confident smile that suggested he knew I would leave early. As I rushed out, I heard him say he'd see me soon, though we hadn't made any plans. The moment I got to my car, I called Sarah. Her confusion was genuine. She hadn't set up any date. She didn't know anyone named Michael, had never mentioned setting me up with anyone recently. I sat in my car, hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The following days were a blur of paranoia and fear. I obsessively checked my social media accounts, trying to figure out how he could have learned so much about me. But some of these memories weren't documented anywhere. They existed only in my mind. A week after the date, I received a friend request from a blank profile. There was just one post, a photo I'd never seen before of me at 8 years old, sitting on my grandmother's porch. The caption mentioned details about that summer that only I could have known. I immediately deactivated all my accounts. Last week, I glimpsed someone watching my apartment from across the street, tall, wearing a gray suit. By the time I rushed to the window for a better look, they were gone. I moved apartments the next day. Now I keep the coffee receipt from Cafe Luna in my drawer, the only tangible proof that afternoon wasn't just a nightmare. I still don't know who he was or how he knew those things about me. Sarah feels terrible, even though none of this was her fault. Sometimes I catch myself searching crowds for his face, wondering if he's still watching. The most terrifying part isn't just what he knew, it's what else he might know. I should have known something was wrong the moment I pulled up to that Victorian house. The porch light flickered like a warning signal, but I ignored it. That's what happens when you're lonely and desperate enough to try online dating. You overlook the red flags. I matched with Sarah on Hinge 3 weeks ago. Her profile was carefully crafted, just enough detail to seem genuine without revealing too much. A 28-year-old chef with copper-colored hair and a passion for vintage photography. We spent days messaging back and forth about our shared interests in true crime podcasts and 80 Seconds movies. When she suggested cooking dinner at her place, I jumped at the chance. The house sat at the end of a quiet street, partially hidden behind overgrown oak trees. It was larger than I expected, with peeling white paint and dark windows that seemed to watch me as I walked up the cracked pathway. Sarah opened the door before I could knock. She looked exactly like her photos, wearing a flour-dusted apron and a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The interior was a mix of modern and vintage crystal chandeliers hanging above IKEA furniture, antique mirrors reflecting LED lights. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the air, but there was something else underneath, musty and metallic. Sarah led me to the living room while she finished cooking. Everything seemed normal at first. Family photos on the walls, a stack of cooking magazines, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table. That's when I first heard it. A dull thump from somewhere below, like someone dropping a heavy book. Then another, and another. The sound was irregular but persistent. I tried to focus on the classical music playing from hidden speakers, but the thumping kept drawing my attention. It seemed to get louder whenever Sarah left the room. Dinner was elaborate, handmade ravioli in a wine sauce that must have taken hours to prepare. Sarah kept refilling my wine glass, asking questions about my daily routine, my apartment, my habits. The thumping continued throughout the meal. Sometimes it would stop for a few minutes, making the silence feel heavy and expectant, before starting again with renewed intensity. I excused myself to use the bathroom, following Sarah's directions down a narrow hallway. The bathroom door was next to another door, heavy oak with a steel padlock hanging from a reinforced latch. The lock was massive, industrial grade, completely out of place in a residential home. It wasn't fully closed. Standing there, I could hear the thumping more clearly. It had a rhythm now, almost like Morse code. My hands moved toward the lock before I could stop myself. The metal was cold, well-oiled, recently used. I glanced back toward the dining room, hearing Sarah cleaning up dishes. My heart was pounding as I slowly lifted the lock. The basement stairs creaked despite my careful steps. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, illuminating a finished basement that had been converted into some kind of workspace. A professional camera sat on a tripod. Developing trays lined metal shelves. But it was the back room that made my blood run cold. Every inch of wall space was covered with photographs. Recent ones on top, me leaving my apartment that morning, getting coffee yesterday, working out last week. Older ones underneath, yellowing at the edges, showing moments from months or even years ago. Me sleeping through my bedroom window. Me checking mail. Me talking on the phone in places I couldn't even remember being. Each photo was dated, labeled, cataloged with clinical precision. A fresh thump made me jump. It came from behind a door at the far end of the room, hidden behind a stack of photo albums. I took one step toward it, then heard Sarah's footsteps above. I ran back upstairs, forcing myself to close the basement door quietly and replace the lock with trembling fingers. My mouth was dry as I made excuses about a work emergency. Sarah's smile never wavered as she walked me to the door. She even packed leftover ravioli in a container, acting disappointed but not surprised by my sudden departure. As I drove away, I saw her watching from an upstairs window. The police found nothing when they investigated. The basement was empty except for old boxes and cleaning supplies. No photos, no camera equipment, no evidence of anyone living there. The elderly couple who owned the house said they'd been renting to a young woman, but her references and background check turned out to be elaborate fakes. Sarah disappeared completely. Her dating profile vanished. The photos she'd sent me wouldn't load anymore. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I'll catch a glimpse of copper hair in a crowd, or hear footsteps behind me when I'm walking alone. and I know she's still out there, still watching, still collecting moments of my life I never knew were being stolen. What happened 3 months ago at that cafe changed everything I thought I knew about reality. It started with a dating app, one of those mainstream ones everyone uses. After being single for 2 years, my best friend Amy practically forced me to download it. I matched with this guy named Mark after a few days of swiping. His profile was pretty basic, hiking photos, a picture with a golden retriever, and one of those typical office group shots. We chatted for about 2 weeks, and everything seemed normal. He worked in tech, loved true crime podcasts, and had just moved to the city 6 months ago. Nothing set off any red flags. We agreed to meet at the Bean Counter, this local cafe I'd been to dozens of times. It's one of those places with exposed brick walls, local artwork, and enough people around to feel safe for a first date. I got there 20 minutes early, as usual, ordered my usual vanilla latte, and picked a table near the window where I could see the door. That's when my entire world tilted sideways. The man who walked through the door wasn't Mark, at least, not the Mark from the dating profile. It was Johnny, my ex-boyfriend who had vanished without a trace 5 years ago. Every detail was exactly as I remembered. The slight crook in his nose from breaking it in high school, the wire-rimmed glasses he always pushed up with his middle finger, even that tiny scar above his right eyebrow from falling off his bike when he was 12. My hand started shaking so badly that my coffee spilled across the table. Johnny had disappeared during our senior year of college. One day he was there, planning our spring break trip to Florida, and the next day, gone. His apartment was empty, his phone disconnected, all social media deleted. His car was still in the parking lot, but there was no trace of him anywhere. The police investigation went nowhere. His family was devastated. I spent months checking hospitals, calling shelters, posting on missing persons forums. Eventually, the case went cold. Some people thought he'd had a mental break. Others suggested witness protection, but no one ever found answers. Yet here he was, scanning the cafe like he was looking for someone, looking for his blind date, looking for me. When our eyes met, there wasn't even a flicker of recognition. He walked over with a stranger's smile and asked if I was Sarah. His voice was exactly the same, but he spoke differently, no trace of the southern accent he'd picked up from his mom. I sat there paralyzed as he talked about growing up in Seattle. Johnny was from Atlanta, attending UC Berkeley. He went to UGA and working at a tech startup. Everything he said was completely different from Johnny's life, but every gesture, every mannerism was identical. The way he ran his hand through his hair when he was nervous, how he tapped his fingers on the table in a specific pattern. It was all Johnny. When I finally managed to speak, I asked him about Atlanta, about UGA, about his sister Emma. He looked at me with genuine confusion, then concern. He leaned in close, and what he said made my blood run cold. "I'm not who you think I am." I grabbed my purse and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. That night, I dug out my old photo albums, the ones I'd packed away years ago. Every picture confirmed what I already knew. It was Johnny, down to the smallest detail. The next day, I went back to the cafe. The morning barista remembered him but described someone completely different, shorter, blonde, no glasses. I checked the dating app, but Mark's profile had vanished. I called Johnny's sister Emma, but she just sighed and said I needed to move on. I couldn't let it go. I started digging through old missing persons forums again, searching for similar cases. I found nothing. The original detective on Johnny's case had retired. The new detective listened to my story but suggested I talk to someone about trauma and grief. Then last week, something happened that made everything worse. I was getting groceries at the store across town, and I saw him again. Different clothes, different haircut, but the same face. He was with a woman, holding hands, looking at produce. When they passed my aisle, I heard her call him Andrew. I've moved apartments since then, changed my number, deleted all my social media. I keep telling myself I imagined it all, that grief and loneliness played tricks on my mind. But I know what I saw. Yesterday, I drove past the bean counter. There was a "for lease" sign in the window. When I asked the shop next door, they said it had closed down suddenly last week. No explanation, just emptied out overnight. I don't use dating apps anymore. I don't go on blind dates. Sometimes I catch myself checking faces in crowds,